Hi, this is Stephen Carson. I'm coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Welcome. I've been in and out a bit because of travel, but we're back with Black Horse this week, and we thought we'd talk about, well, had a request, viewer request to talk about Trump tariffs, but the problem is we don't really know what those are going to be yet. There's proposals, right? But he hasn't even been sworn in yet, and then I assume there's some negotiation and wrangling and stuff. So, from the point of view of what we do on this show, we would want to see them actually in place, or at least a pretty strong idea of what they'll be before trying to talk about potential effects. But we do have something we can talk about, which is he was already president for 4 years. So we can look at what happened last time and what the impacts were. So that's what we'll do, along with one other little econ mini, a little story. Um, let's see. Before I bring on Black Horse, the show gratefully receives support from people on Subscribestar. Really helpful as I'm negotiating with my graphic designer to do some video editing and to do more of what I did recently with the edited video. I want to try to alternate the live streams with Black Horse with edited videos. And that'll cost a little more, and we're working that out. But your support is really going to help me make that happen. Okay. Welcome, Black Horse.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Pretty good. I guess, well, we have talked since the election, right? But I'm just curious, big furor in the US, right? And of course, more than Americans pay attention to it. But at this point, is it like, yeah, Trump's been reelected, life's back to normal in Canada? It doesn't matter that much.
I mean,
Or are
the
people
big issue
freaking
in
out like
Canada,
it's Brexit slash Trump first term 2.0 or something?
yeah, I mean there are really big issues in Canadian politics at the moment, and the fact that it looks like we may have Trump versus Justin Trudeau in the negotiations for the replacement to the Mexico-Canada U.S. trade agreement is there's some consternation about that in
Ah.
the
Okay, so
Canadian
wait a second.
press.
I'm probably going too far back. It was once called NAFTA. Is it still?
Yeah, so this was originally called NAFTA, negotiated in the late 80s, early 90s,
Yeah.
and it was incredibly controversial in Canada at the time. It reversed more than a century of Canadian economic policy
Mm.
in order to. So the long-standing policy of the Laurentian elite was a protectionist trade regime targeted at the United States. Um, in order to protect their fenced gardens of
Mm.
industrial concerns.
Oh, okay.
Um, there was a great war inside Canadian politics in the 80s that ended with uh, opening up Canada to U.S. investment and opening markets south in facing Canada and Mexico, or facing the U.S. and Mexico. Um,
So this would have been perceived by some as turning Canada into sort of an economic vassal of the United States, right?
Yeah, yeah, that
Yeah.
there was, but really, it's a big fight between the industrial part of the Laurentian elite and the kind of government part of the Laurentian elite at the time. Um, but Canada's economy adapted in the subsequent years to be, enormously dependent on this relationship. Um, and so when Trump 1.0 came along, there was a lot of consternation because one of his campaign pledges was to renegotiate NAFTA,
Uh,
um, that- which resulted in the Canada, Mexico, USA trade agreement, um, which from Canada's point of view it turned out not to be a particularly profound change.
oh,
I
really?
think,
Okay.
well, I think Trump's real targets were Mexican trade,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
but there's a lot of concern in Canada about the fact that that agreement had an expiry, and it's going to expire during Trump's second term. and
Trump losing in 2020 was all 4D chess, so he could be in for the renegotiation of this, right?
yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of consternation in Canada about what is going to happen here, um, because as I say, the Canadian economy has kind of evolved to be completely dependent on this trade relationship, um,
Ah,
and so
so
it will be
for
tremendous.
some bizarre reason, I don't know why he would do that. I don't think he's talking about anything doing anything like this. But if for some reason he threw up major trade barriers with Canada, that would be a big problem for
Well,
Canada, right?
I mean, there was the floated idea during the campaign of financing the entire U.S. government on tariff revenue,
Hmm.
and there were a whole bunch of journalists' heads exploded in Canada over this because you know the U.S. could definitely do it, and it would uh, what it would profoundly change the U.S. in a whole pile of ways, but it would basically end the economic system that we know as we know it in Canada.
Oh wow,
Um,
yeah,
so uh, you know, I don't expect that to happen, but there's definitely some consternation,
right.
especially because the interpersonal relationship between Trump and Trudeau is not very good. Um,
Really, I'm shocked. Trudeau hasn't won him over with his beautiful face.
well, I mean, Trudeau makes like a career of comparing his political opponents in Canada to Trump as like a slur. So it's you know you can understand why that relationship would be less than ideal.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to come back to the things we've just been talking about in just a few minutes, but let's start by revisiting this Bud Light boycott story, famous in our circles for producing many Steve Turley uh,
Yeah,
videos.
that's true.
Right? He did like 19 videos on the Bud Light boycott or something because it was like the first boycott in living memory that had come from conservatives or whatever that seemed to actually have any teeth to it at all, right? So
Yeah.
before we explain how, what is it AA says, academic agent says, he says, the finance bros explain how nothing ever happens every time, before we explain how nothing ever happened, um, fair to say that it actually it did have some teeth to it, unlike many things like this that basically the companies targeted just literally don't care. It means nothing to them. It doesn't affect them. They just
Yeah,
don't pay attention to it or they laugh about it, right?
we made a prediction on this show that the Bud Light boycott had an opportunity to be a problem for Bud Light as a brand,
Mm-hmm.
but that because it was targeted at Bud Light as a brand, and we looked at the profile of AB InBev as a corporate umbrella, that it did not have an opportunity to substantially disrupt the organization at the corporate or board level.
Right.
Um, and so we made a prediction. We're going to come back and discuss how that panned out because that's how Econ Minis works.
Right.
So
Did you want anything out of this WSJ article besides flashing the headline on the screen?
I mean, not really.
Okay, that's fine.
All there, if you read the sub headline, it gives away the game.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Sales of Bud Light as a brand are still down, but the corporate portfolio of brands has seen leaching from Bud Light to other brands owned by AB InBev.
Yeah.
Um, and
Stick it to Bud Light by buying our other beer over here, right?
exactly. It's been really bad. Like if you were an ad exec at Bud Light and that was the brand you were responsible for, a lot of people got fired at Bud Light over this.
They did.
Uh, yeah, lots of
Okay.
people did.
So
And you see, they now have, you know, they're doing their best to kind of pander to conservatives.
yeah, I think I have
A
seen some
new
of their advertising. Yeah.
they've got a new ad campaign out right now, which is intended to like where the white rural farmer is the hero and the heavily made up uh, urban woman is the the heel of the ad. So
Okay.
they've definitely it has had an effect on the brand approach for Bud Light for sure.
Got it.
But so that's one piece of the prediction. The other piece of the prediction was AB InBev as a corporate entity would not only survive, um, it would not be a dramatic event, even if the boycott was successful and persistent.
Hmm.
The boycott was successful and significantly persistent. It's more than a year later, and we still have like the sales of Bud Light as a brand have not recovered. But if we flip
Yeah.
over to the stock chart,
Yeah. Sorry. Just from the chat, Richard King says Bud Light is the queen of beer. So there you go. They're
there you
still
go.
going after them. Okay. So yeah, the chart.
Yeah, so 3-year stock chart. I've highlighted the period immediately after the boycott, after it became obvious that the boycott was going to be going to be impactful. So you can see that there's definitely a sentiment hit there.
Hmm.
Um, but I mean, it's a sentiment hit of a scale of a lot of other moves that you know have nothing at all to do with consumer boycotts.
Right.
So there there's some sentiment ahead. It's not nothing ever happened, but AB InBev is a giant company with a giant portfolio of other brands. Um, its earnings in this quarter were pretty good in the U.S., and their biggest problem is that their earnings in Asia Pacific are poor. Um, so, if I took away the highlight, you probably wouldn't be able to tell me where the
Where the
boycott was.
boycott was. Yeah. Now, okay, but I'm trying to do the glass half full on this. Uh, it didn't bring down the company, right? And we didn't think it would. But certain people who I assume made decisions leading to the advertisement that bothered everybody um, lost their jobs. That's a signal, right?
Yep.
People don't like losing their jobs. So that's a signal to people that, if they go in that direction, it's risky to do that. And part of the reason they lost their jobs is because it really did have an impact on,
Well,
on that at least that portion of the company, and they were like, okay, we don't want more of this. Go away.
well,
You know?
like Bud Light as a brand was probably marked on the books of AB InBev as like a multi-billion-dollar asset.
Yeah.
Damaging the value of that asset is it's not nothing.
Yeah.
So like that's the reason why uh, lots of people in at Bud Light or at AB InBev lost their jobs over this. They damaged the asset value, the value of a valuable asset for the company.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
that's different than taking down the whole corporate structure, but
Yeah.
uh, it's something,
Yeah.
and it's enough that the brand is now uh, trying to pay country music stars to endorse Bud Light and all this other
Hmm.
crap. So
And many of the country stars are probably like, I'm not sure I want to be associated with Bud Light, actually, right? So that
yeah,
which points to what you just said, which is that the brand has taken a big hit because of this.
yeah. So it,
Okay, yeah, I
it's
think
interesting. It's worth coming back to.
yeah,
I hate it when people like make this a big story for a month and then don't come back to it two
yeah,
years later and see what happened. So that's
exactly.
why we're doing that.
Yeah, so let's say if some other outrage comes along, the wokeness or whatever, something extremely offensive to conservative people and stuff comes out of one of these companies. I mean, would you like discourage people from doing another targeted boycott like this, or would you say, go for it?
I mean, my view is the same as what I presented at the time, that the more a company is a quote pure play, the more damage you can do with a consumer
Mm,
boycott.
hmm.
So
Right.
if you remember at the time, there were two boycotts going on. There's a boycott targeting Bud Light and a lesser publicized boycott targeting Target, the retail brand. Target is a pure play and a struggling brand. So if you could have engineered uh, the same consumer action targeting them that you were able to engineer targeting Bud Light, you could have blotted out a name on the Fortune 500, right?
Yeah. Wow.
Um,
Taking a scalp in a noticeable way is what you're saying.
yeah.
Yeah. I
So,
see.
I mean, you kind of it's hard to control where this kind of opportunity exists.
Right.
Um, but definitely some boycotts are more worthwhile than others.
Hmm.
Um,
Good point.
and so
Yeah.
I would say that uh, if conservative media, especially conservative new media, wants to spend their powder on boycotts, it should be thoughtful as to um, which ones it chooses.
Yep. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. Um, and now, unfortunately, in a way, it's unfortunate that this happened first, right? Because what would have been nice is to do something like Target, take a scalp like that, and then bigger companies would go, well, what's the headroom on this, right?
Yeah,
They
exactly.
only took out, number 400 out of the Fortune 500. I'm at number 200. Am I safe?
Yeah.
I don't know, Whereas this kind of makes people go, yeah, if you're in Bev, you're probably safe.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of unfortunate that very few companies in the S&P 500 are actually vulnerable to a consumer action like this. Um,
Yeah, a lot of
because
them are not even consumer facing in their business, basically, right?
well, there's that, but the thing that made the Bud Light boycott possible is that the consumer base was absolutely dominated by conservative men. So
Yeah, right.
uh, it made it uniquely vulnerable.
Hmm.
Uh, I I'm not enough of an expert in consumer product distribution to know what other uh, brands might be vulnerable to this, but there aren't that many. You could target somebody like Harley Davidson.
Yeah, right,
Is
right.
another classic candidate for this. That they're a pure play. Their brand is associated with a certain kind of masculinity. If they
Yeah,
made a kind of wokeness mistake and you targeted them, you could really take a scalp there.
yeah, yeah,
Um, but the opportunities to do that are relatively few in number.
right,
So it's just you you all- you can't control. You can't always totally control where you're going to target where opportunities like this arise, and so I just think some combination of opportunism, thoughtfulness is appropriate here.
right. And I didn't prep you for this, so understood if you don't know, but why hasn't this been done from the other side against Tesla? Um, or
Well, it
have they
has.
tried?
So like the- I don't have a chart. I didn't put a chart in the show notes. I should have, but one of the reasons Tesla stock has gone to the moon since Trump was elected is that Tesla was unfairly targeted. Here, let me. I'm just going to send this to you.
Sure,
Do you mind pulling this up? It's
we'll
in
do it.
your Twitter DMs. Um, so Tesla's stock went from roughly 200 to roughly 350 as a consequence of the Trump election. Um, this is one of the most profound reactions to a single election that I can ever remember. And this is all about the fact that in the period from maybe 2018, 2019 to presumably 2024, uh, Tesla has been targeted by the application of EV subsidies. So there are huge subsidies for electric vehicles that have been engineered specifically to exclude Teslas on the basis that they're high value automobiles. Um, and so Tesla has been swimming against a massive subsidy for all of its rivals for quite some
Oh,
time.
okay. I'm sorry. So other electric vehicle makers are shooting at a more down market or something, and
Yeah.
so they now was this done to target Musk, or it had that's just the way that subsidies were for some other reason?
Well, so this has been progressively becoming a problem as Musk has become progressively a figure associated with the right. So this first happened in California, where California had state EV subsidies, uh,
Hmm.
and the price threshold on state EV subsidies was reset explicitly to be just a price point just lower than a Tesla. Um,
Very nice.
so
Uh,
I think that happened in 2019, in 2020, something like that.
hmm.
Um, so I haven't prepped this story, so
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
apologize if I've
That's
got
fine.
some details wrong. But this has been going on in Blue America and at the federal level for quite some time.
Okay, so if we
And
looked at a longer chart, we would actually see that they have Tesla took a hit from all that counteraction
well,
5 years
what,
ago
what's
or
hap-
whatever.
what's happened is Tesla has taken a hit over time because it
Mm-hmm.
hasn't been just one subsidy, it hasn't been just
Mm-hmm.
one state, it hasn't been
Yeah,
just
yeah.
the feds. There's been a dozen plus of these subtle decisions about how to engineer subsidies that have caused Tesla to kind of have to swim against the current in the market for electric vehicles. Um, and the Trump administration, one of its key proposals is to eliminate the subsidies for electric vehicles altogether. So, by eliminating the subsidy for all of Tesla's rivals,
Uh,
uh, it will put Musk's company in a vastly better competitive position, which is why
hmm.
the stock has reacted the way it has.
That's interesting. Interesting that they're doing it that way as opposed to trying to give subsidies to Tesla. They're just saying we're gonna let it be a level playing field, and I guess the market is saying on a level playing field, Tesla's got a lot
Yeah,
going
Tesla's
for
going to win.
it. Yeah. Huh. Okay. Well, thank you. Okay. So yeah, that was not a because I thought there might be some big consumer boycott because I guess I thought the buyers of Tesla vehicles tended to be more,
Tend to be more
environmental
left wing. Yeah.
leftist. Yeah, yeah. So I thought there might be some big consumer action, but you're saying it was actually government, just pure enemy, targeting a political enemy from the governing class. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know enough to know whether there's been any organized attempt at a consumer action against Tesla. I don't know of any,
Hmm.
but certainly they've leveraged the organs of power against them.
Wow.
So
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Sprung that one on you. Um, okay. So leaving punishing various companies aside, we're going to go to punishing entire countries, right? And that
yeah.
is that uh, yeah, as I said, we had a request to talk about uh, what the potential impact of Trump's tariffs would be in his second term, but I didn't want to do that because it's all talk, and as we all know, hopefully by now, um, Trump will put a crazy position out there, have everybody react to it, and then fall back to basically he's always negotiating. Every time he opens his mouth, it seems he's negotiating, right? So I would not take whatever tariff proposals are out there as an indication of what would actually be put into effect or what he could put into effect or whatever, right? So so
Well,
I
it's
didn't
also
go ahead.
fair to say that winning an election is not the same thing as controlling the government. It's very
Yeah,
unclear exactly what Trump will or won't be able to do. So
right.
we'll
Well,
see, I guess.
Trump's first term in particular taught us that lesson, right? Of all U.S. presidencies, presidential terms,
Yeah.
as academic agent put it so well, he did not have the access to operate the machine, even though he was the president, right? The machine of the deep state or whatever would not function for him by and large. Um, okay, so instead of trying to speculate, we'll wait until there's something more solid to go on to analyze the second term tariffs. We can look back at the first term tariffs, which is great. I love this because this gives us a chance to have a baseline of reality. This is, what actually happened, when it actually happened, what the impacts were to trade. So it gives us a baseline for us to come back to this story later and have something to compare to, right? Are these tariffs bigger than the ones from his first term? Is he getting them through faster? All that sort of stuff. we'll have a great basis of comparison by. So think of this as a prologue to a Trump tariff 2.0 stream to come in some time later. Okay, so first thing, I had to look at this carefully to understand what you are sharing here is not the percentage of tariffs, it's the number of US tariffs investigations. And this is basically an indication of how heavily they were enforcing tariffs on, which countries were getting tariffs
Yeah.
enforced on them most heavily, right?
So the actual mechanism for the Trump tariffs was Trump created. Well, I don't know whether how old this entity is, but there's an entity in the U.S. government that you can complain to if you think that uh, inside the particular industry you're operating, there's unfair trade practices going on in some other country.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so these are the complaints that were taken up by that board. So there were
Right.
40 separate complaints made about Chinese trade product practices in various different industries that came to the tariff board for investigation. That tariff board then adjudicated and decided what if any tariffs should be imposed in order to correct for that unfair trade practice.
Right. And then India had like 12 compared to the
Yeah.
China's 40. So
So like I can speak
China,
to
this is an
I
indicator that China was seriously a target of this stuff.
Yeah, so I can speak like the five that are targeted to Canada
Mm-hmm.
were in the lumber and dairy industries. So uh, U.S. producers believe that Canadians unfairly subsidize their their beef or
Mm.
their milk and timber industries, and so
Mm-hmm.
they are constantly complaining to U.S. authorities to try to get them to impose tariffs on these goods to
Right.
varying degrees of effect.
Right. Got it. Yeah. So China and India, well, China, the big story by a long shot. India, number two, quite a bit distant. And then not so far from India, South Korea, Thailand. Um,
Yeah.
gives you the basic
And
idea.
and critically, all these are not created equal. Not every industry is the same size. Not every tariff
Mm-hmm.
judgment is going to be the same size. So, but this just kind of gives you an indication of who the hit list was.
Yep. Got it. Okay. And now customs revenue. Okay. This is going to be tricky because the part on the right where it jumps up is very distracting, but that is a projection um, of, uh, let's see, this is, I guess, Trump's proposal,
Yeah, this comes out
right?
of. You might remember during the election campaign, there were various proposals floated all the way to end income tax and fund the entire U.S. government from tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
So there's you know there were various white papers written about this, but I pulled this one because uh, I the data on actually collected import tariffs over the last 10 years is quite instructive, and it's quite instructive to kind of see the fact that what is being speculated for Trump 2.0 is a dramatic discontinuity with that past.
Yeah, which I don't want to emphasize that much, like I said, because that might be just his starting proposal in his usual negotiation style, right?
Well, and it's worth noting that like he talked extensively about tariffs in his first administration, and what he got was a substantial increase from the past, but it was nowhere near the kind of magnitude that's being discussed now. So,
Right, right. And just historical note, you probably know this, but the U.S. federal government was originally funded by uh, tariff revenues until the income tax about 100 years ago. So it would actually be returned to tradition. The
well,
the problem being
and
that the US government is massive compared to when it was being funded by tariff revenues.
well,
So
the other problem is that the tariff tax structure that existed in the U.S. at the time was a significant source of tension within the union as well. Right? It's
mhm.
credited as one of the major causes of the Civil War.
Yes, right,
Um,
right. Which I
so
which we discussed on this channel in in the series on in a show about the economic origins of the war
But
between the states. So,
like, assume for a moment you impose tariffs large enough to fund the U.S. government again that way. They're going to have a really unequal impact on different parts of the country, and
yeah,
it is inevitable that some people are going to be unhappy about that.
right. So anyway, ignoring the hash bars or whatever on the right, which are just pure speculation. Let's look at the solid bars, which, as far as we know, even though one of them is 2025, that's a little confusing. But as far as we know, this is a much more solid data, just reflecting what's happened. And there is a jump, nearly a doubling maybe, from 2018 to 2019. That's 2 years into Trump's term.
Yeah,
What happened there?
that's when Trump finally gets his tariffs on China.
Okay, so that's a battling through the legislature delay in him
Yeah.
getting his tariffs, right? Okay.
Yeah, you might remember his tariffs got caught up in court for a long time. He tried to enact them right away, and it took a long
Hmm.
time to get them through the courts.
Gotcha. Okay. Oh, it wasn't legislature, it's courts. Okay. Um, right. Um, then there's one other aspect which we're going to highlight again on the next thing, which is that people might notice that these tariffs jump up in 2019, 2020. Then Biden is elected, and the tariffs don't go back down. In fact, they go up higher. Or I'm sorry, this isn't the tariffs. This is the revenue, customs
The
revenue,
revenue from
right?
the tariffs.
Yeah, revenue goes up even higher in the last couple of years under President Biden. What does this mean?
Yeah, so this is one of the areas where there is apparently consensus between left and right in the U.S. Appears polarization is over.
The famous bipartisan consensus, peace in our time.
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly why the Democrats have decided that they're on board with tariffs on China. It's not really. It's an aspect of U.S. politics that I'm not. I don't claim that I understand all that well,
Hmm.
but the Biden administration, for better or for worse, not only continued Trump's policies of tariffs on China, but actually accelerated it.
Mm.
Um,
Okay, so you actually know that, because I can't totally tell that from the chart. It might just be increased revenues because increased trade, and the absolute number goes up because it's a percentage of, you know what I mean? It could just be
yeah,
growth in trade, but you're saying that actually the Biden administration pushed even harder on this.
yeah, a little bit.
Okay.
Not a dramatic discontinuity, but they've continued to push very hard. And when we flip later, we'll see that volume of trade has gone down precipitously with China, yet revenue has stayed the same, which
Hmm.
means rates have gone up quite a bit.
Okay. Gotcha. Funny comment here from the chat. If the chart is true, I think he means the speculative part. The black market is going to be amazing. So yeah, market opportunities, folks. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, one of the lesser known pieces of Canadian history is we used to have a huge black market in farm equipment.
huh?
So
Why?
back in the like late 19th and early 20th century, the national policy tariffs prevented you from buying farm equipment from the U.S. Um,
Oh,
you had to buy it from you had to buy farm equipment manufactured in Great Britain. Now,
oh,
you
okay.
might imagine that that would impose not only a degree of expense, but a degree of inconvenience.
Right.
And Canada and the US share like a 3,000-mile unguarded border. So there's a huge black market in manufactured goods, particularly farm equipment, and later alcohol going the other way.
Right. Yeah. Well,
That grew up
I knew
along with
about that part. Yeah.
yeah
Yeah. I'm just
that grew
imagining people with buckets of paint. Yeah, I don't know, painting tractors to look like British tractors at the border or something.
yeah, like basically just driving them across empty fields because that's what the border was at the time, right?
Yeah. Right. Right.
So
Okay. So continuing with the theme of Biden tariffs, we can see collected under Trump versus on the left, collected under Biden on the right, matches what we were just saying, which is that, well, part of this story would be that, as we discussed, Trump didn't get the tariffs actually put in place until halfway through his term. And so he didn't get a full term of them. Biden did. That's got to explain a good chunk of that, right? Um, but then what you're saying is Biden administration actually pushed harder on this. And what were you saying? The amount of trade went down, but the amount collected went up.
That's correct. So we'll see this more when we go to the next chart.
Oh,
But the
okay, okay,
amount of trade between China and the U.S. has declined quite a bit in the period between 2016 and today. And yet the revenue on tariffs has continued to
gotcha.
increase.
Okay. Yeah, and might be a little hard for folks to see, but the yellow part, with the predominant part of these two bar charts, is section 301, which is the part targeted at China in particular, and that yellow part, as Black Horse was just saying, is the main thing contributing to this being so tall under Biden, even though trade has gone down. Which we'll jump right to see that, right?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. So if you think of China as the top everything's made in China trading partner of the US, you might be some years out of date because that's not really true anymore, is it?
Yeah, no. So this is something that I had to see in data before I could kind of properly accept. Um, but we all lived through the rise in trade with China,
Right.
especially the rise in trade in high value goods with China. So if you
Hmm.
go back to 1990, made in China was kind of your dollar store items. Uh, if you fast forward to 2010, made in China was your smartphones, your computer
Yep.
components,
Yep.
anything heavy manufactured, steel, those kinds of industries. Anything that required a lot of electricity or burning a lot of coal was made in China,
Hmm.
um, because contrary to the popular narrative about cheap labor, the primary drive towards China was the emergence of the EPA as a dominant factor in industrial policy.
Oh, okay.
Right. So
Not
if you
a giant NIMBY effect, right? We're not going to do this over
exactly,
here, so it's going to have to happen somewhere else. Oh, China, they allow it, right?
yeah, it turns out you can burn all the coal you want in China. Um, so, like the big reason there's a huge Chinese steel industry and not a huge European or American steel industry is this factor, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
so that
So what I was emphasizing is that we've got what, not quite 10, but nearly 10 years where China is the top trading partner. Well, more than 10 years. There's a little discontinuity there, but more than 10 years where China's the top trading partner. That's what we all remember. That is old news now. That as of a couple of years ago, that's not true anymore. And it's dropped to, in this chart, the fourth biggest trading partner from the first. So that's quite a dramatic change, not just in that ordinal
yeah,
ranking, but
the chart is
the
not
amount.
totally fair. The
Oh,
chart is
okay.
not totally fair because the European Union is counted as one trading partner.
Uh, Gotcha.
As far as I understand, the European Union is not yet a country.
Right.
Um, but
Yeah.
uh, but number three trading partner, and critically, it went from something like 18 to 20% of U.S. trade was with
Yeah.
China to 13%. So a
Right.
much smaller fraction, regardless of where you want to put the rank.
Yep.
Um, and the other huge story here is the emergence of Mexico as an important trading partner with the
Right.
United States. Um, and that is an agricultural story, but that is also an industrial story,
Mm,
um,
okay. So they've
which
slowly
is
been building up their manufacturing base there.
yeah. A great deal of there's a great deal of manufacturing done in Mexico now, which is it's a story that people don't talk about very often.
Well, I notice it's a little hard to read because of the light blue color they chose for Mexico here, and it's meant to be faded because they're highlighting China. But um, the China amount, if you ignore, it moving between different positions as trading partner, the thickness of the line is kind of pretty variable, it seems to me. Um,
Yeah,
and whereas Mexico if you kind of put the pieces together in your mind, you see a slow and steady growth from 5.7% in 1989 to 15% now, but I see no dramatic shrinkage or growth. It just slowly but steadily becomes a bigger trading partner over 25, or I'm sorry, 35 years.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat about how much
Yeah.
of the commerce done with Mexico is actually American firms or actually Chinese firms
Mm,
operating in Mexico. The answer is a large percentage.
okay.
Um, so one of the issues in dealing with nation state economies in a world where uh, cross border investment is normal is it's kind of you apply tariffs on goods made in a country, but not on goods made by capital originating from a country. So it's hard to know exactly um, how much the CCP strategy of investing using sovereign wealth in assets outside the country plays into this. Um, but you know, we're certainly looking at a change nonetheless.
Right. Okay. Any other comments you want to make on this?
Um, Not really, except that to note that the decline in trade from China is a fairly direct consequence of the tariffs, right? It
Right.
doesn't.
Yeah.
It's not a secular trend that was accelerated by the tariffs. It's the tariffs.
Right. Right. It's a reversal of a trend, in fact, it seems like.
Yes.
Um, though that's very interesting you bring up the EPA because then that makes both the dramatic jump in 2010-ish and the decline. They're both political events, not really market events, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
One
most
one
discontinuities you see,
one political event favored China, another
yeah,
political event didn't favor China, but neither of them were like organic, you know.
and both of them occurred in as a result of domestic U.S. considerations, which is quite
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Hard to be a friend with America. Okay. All right. America's trading partners. Okay. Now this one is vertical.
2023, you know,
Yeah, and it's a vertical chart, so it's a little hard. So let me walk us through it real quick. So you've got on the left of that center bar, you've got imports, and it's breaking down the countries uh, importing into America. On the right, you have America exporting to countries. Okay, so the dark blue at the top is Canada, and then Mexico under Canada, right? And we see a fairly um, even amount of imports and exports. That is about as much value is imported as is exported between the US and Mexico and Canada. So that gives you the basic idea. Next thing down, or I'm sorry, then there's an even darker blue under that, and that's various European countries. Um, and here we start to see a little bit more of a discontinuity, I think, where there's more imported than is exported. Then in pink, I guess, is Asia. China being a big player, but not it's not 50% China. I mean, all these Southeast Asian countries, Japan and so forth, it all adds up, right? Um, but here you really notice that the amount coming in from Asia, the value is much greater than the value going to Asia, being exported to China, Asia. Who was it? Peter Schiff, I think. He would say, how long can it last that they send us stuff and we send them green pieces of money, green colored pieces of
yeah, yeah.
paper, and then from there. So, um, okay, so what is it, before we get to that disparity thing, which is sort of a separate topic, the disparity between exports and imports, what did you want to call out about this from a tariff point of view?
Yeah, so it's worth noting here who are the likely targets of tariffs. So it's all the
Mm-hmm.
people who have big gaps between imports and exports. Because when you apply tariffs to foreign actors, they tend to apply them back in your direction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so countries like the Southeast Asian countries are all countries that can't really respond effectively if tariffs are applied to them. Um, or would have difficulty responding because of the large trade imbalance. And so, if the Trump administration follows through on its tariff policies, you should expect that the Southeast Asian countries and the European countries are the countries which are most vulnerable.
Hmm.
Um, the U.S. could really wreck the economy of China, of Canada, with tariffs, but you couldn't really raise a lot of revenue doing it, because
Hmm.
uh, whatever tariffs it applies to Canada will be applied to U.S. goods, and
Hmm.
whatever trade continues will be on a fairly balanced basis. Um, that's just not the case for many of these Southeast Asian countries.
Hmm.
The
They
other thing I wanted to
they have less leverage in a trade war, is what you're saying.
e- exactly,
Yeah, yeah.
and interestingly and surprisingly to, I think, a lot of our audience, the same situation prevails in Europe that prevails in Southeast Asia, where
Mm.
there's a huge uh, the United States is a huge net importer of European goods. I
Hmm.
don't think most Americans would appreciate that.
Right. Um, okay, now to a, a topic that just jumps out, though it's slightly not related to tariffs, maybe? I don't know. You tell me. Um, is just the huge disparity, which is marked down at the bottom right in light gray as a deficit. That is the amount they're showing, the amount there graphically of um, goods that export goods that aren't there to match the importing. That is, there's a $1.18 trillion difference if you subtract exports from imports. How is that possible?
So we've talked about this extensively in different streams, but the U.S. Um, is a huge net exporter of dollars, and a huge net importer of physical goods of various descriptions. This is made possible by the various natural sinks internationally of U.S. dollars. So the U.S. has constructed a significant international demand for U.S. dollars. And as long as that international demand continues, then this system of trade deficits can continue. Um, and so you can think of that trade deficit as a proxy for how much the American empire contributes materially to the United States homeland.
Okay. Yeah, and we have uh, not seen any substantive threats to dollar dominance. Some people have had some flashy headlines about BRICS currencies and so forth, but we really haven't seen anything that looks like a serious threat to a global dollar dominance. But let's just use our imagination for a moment, Black Horse, because
Yeah.
I suppose it could happen. It's not impossible that other countries would be like, we are just done. We're just getting ripped off by this whole deal. And we don't care where it is, but we're not using US dollars anymore. Let's just somehow imagine this. Um, I mean, the impact would be that
Well,
US citizen Americans would be a lot poorer in terms of what they could get from abroad, right?
it's complicated. So the
Hmm.
U.S. in a situation like this where there's a large trade deficit, typically you would see the currency respond by declining in relative value until the trade came into balance.
Right.
So, uh, in a situation where the U.S. dollar becomes a regular currency instead of the dominant currency, forget for a moment whatever geopolitical event triggers this and the immediate aftermath. The long-term aftermath of that would be that there'd be value for value exchange in the trade market. Um, so that there would be a decline in standard of living commensurate with, you know, 1.25 trillion a year in reduced value of goods coming to American consumers.
Hmm.
However, uh, there's a giant occupation force for the entire rest of the world that the U.S. supports in order to keep this uh,
Right.
system in place. I don't know exactly what that costs, but it's not nothing. So
Right.
there would be some significant offsetting cost savings that would go with dismantling the empire. So I don't know whether the average U.S. consumer would be better or worse off. It's
Mm,
I don't think 1.2 trillion is that far from the cost of the military occupation of the American empire.
that's a good point.
It it doesn't seem crazy to me that it could be close to that number.
Yeah, the U.S. military isn't known for its virtue of thrift,
No,
right?
no, uh, and like not only is there the that aspect to it, um, there are also um, there are also other kinds of costs that are imposed by the uh, having to thread U.S. Infrastructure through all of these other countries.
Hmm.
So, like one of the reasons why the U.S. can have the EPA that it has is because the political actors who would otherwise be motivated to oppose the EPA can just work around it by locating their operations elsewhere. Um, if you restored a situation where uh, the American elite couldn't escape the consequences of their own policy, you might end up with a more dynamic U.S. economy um, because you would have a single set of rules governing all the actors within the economy. So you might realize some substantial economic benefits uh, that are not as dollars and cents obvious as the reduction in the cost in military cost.
Right.
Um,
That's a good point. Yeah.
so it's not obvious to me that this is a particularly great deal for Americans,
Hmm.
um, but they get some benefit out of it.
Well, I think you make a great point, though. It's the typical uh, problem with this sort of thing, right? Is that the benefit is easy to point to. We're looking at it in this picture, right? But
You know,
the cost becomes a little bit harder to get your hands around, like you're saying.
well,
You
it's
can
not
you
like the
can
U.S.
look at
is
the
going to
cost of
disband.
military. You can look at the
It's not
cost of
like the
military
U.S.
bases, but there's other things
you
that
know,
are more harder to quantify, right?
well, it's not like the U.S. is going to disband its military if the American empire goes away. Like, I'm sure they'll have some force.
Oh yeah,
Maybe it'll be
but
smaller.
you're I think what you were talking about is if we don't have the cost of all of the bases and the Navy ships running all over the Pacific, over there, needling China and all this stuff, right? If all
Yeah.
that
Well,
goes away and you still maybe have a very, very strong domestic military, Fortress America or whatever, it's
yeah.
still probably a massive reduction in cost, right?
Yeah, it's hard to get your fingers around exactly how much less, but it's definitely a lot less.
Yeah.
Um, and you would also be in a situation where you would compel elites to have to be more circumspect about the kind of policy they impose in America because they'd have to actually live with it on their own operations, right? So uh, I it's not obvious to me that get it that the American like as a historian, it, there's a very very clean argument that the British Empire was always a net cost to the United Kingdom,
Yeah.
and usually like a very substantial most years a very substantial net cost to the United Kingdom.
Right.
Um, Now the UK didn't get richer when they dispensed with the empire, particularly,
Hmm.
um, but they also dispensed with the empire after kind of ruining their domestic economy.
Yeah.
Um,
Right, right.
s- so it's not obvious to me exactly how it would play out in terms of the standard of living for average Americans after in a circumstance where this system kind of gets deconstructed. It'd be very disruptive, um, but they might not actually end up poorer if it was done uh, in a in an efficient way.
Okay. I wanted to, oh, any final points you wanted to make on Trump's first round of tariffs, first term tariffs?
Uh, no, except that his first term tariffs. have become political consensus, which I
Mm-hmm.
find quite fascinating.
Right.
I suspect I suspect that regardless of the rhetoric you see in the press, the U.S. elite is gradually becoming they're they're restructuring the way that they operate the American empire to live in multipolarity and to live in a world where China is outside of that empire.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and uh, I just think that's interesting to note. You see a lot of rhetoric in the press of various kinds, but what's actually happening is quite different than the rhetoric you see.
Right. Okay, I want to try to cover a few things, and then we were going to share something that a video that Black Horse made today, and that went out today. Casey Johnson writes that the renminbi, the Chinese yuan, adjusting, literally weakening Chinese purchasing power, and an increase in U.S. Treasury flows were the results of the first round of tariffs.
Yeah, so the Chinese government manages its currency relative to the US dollar in order to pursue its own industrial policy.
Right.
Um, and so their approach to trying to respond in the trade war with the United States was to weaken their currency
Mm-hmm.
in order to adjust the price of their goods downward. Um, this is a bit of a problem for the Chinese government in the long term
Yeah.
because China is a huge importer of is a problem for the standard of living of regular Chinese people because they're a huge importer of things like food that regular people need.
Yeah.
But it's also a problem for their industrial policy can't live like this very well anymore because they're such a huge importer of oil and gas and such a huge importer of coal, iron ore, etc. They're a very resource poor nation. So weakening their currency is not nearly as effective a strategy as I think some Chinese policymakers assumed. I think Chinese policymakers mistakenly assumed that the development of industry in China was a feature of the cost disparity in labor. I think
Mm.
they radically underestimated the extent to which movement of industry outside the United States properly is just a product of environmental regulation.
Gotcha. Yeah. So that was always the story. We can't compete with them. They work for slave wages. I mean, I grew up with this kind
Yeah.
of rhetoric, right? And you're saying, yeah, well, what about the EPA?
Yeah, I kind of think that story about wages is nonsense. If you look at the cost structure of the industries that are dominated by China, like the the cost structure of the steel industry is not driven by labor. I'm sorry, it's
Right.
just not,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Right.
Um,
We've been,
and
in the
so
context of Germany, we've been talking about energy intensive industries, for example, right? Where it's
yeah,
really the cost of these energy expensive processes that completely dominates your costs, not the cost of your workers. And you're saying we've got
yeah.
a lot of similar kinds of industries in China.
Well, I also think so. One of the points that is often made in the financial press is that uh, China dominates the rare earth minerals market and
Mm-hmm.
things like the lithium market. But if you actually look at the geology, that's not because there's a unique geological feature in China that makes these minerals common in China and uncommon anywhere else. It's because the rules for extraction are very different in China than they are anywhere else,
Gotcha.
uh,
Right.
and have been for a very long time.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that the devaluation of the yuan is an example of the Chinese regime kind of um, not fully appreciating how it is they arrived in the position that they arrived in.
Mm-hmm. Another comment, going back to the what you taught us about the black market between Canada and the U.S. Constock says Scotch for tractors. I thought that was a pretty
There you
funny
go.
comment. Fair deal. Um, let's see. Okay, FBI informant. Oh, the feds identify themselves now. Wouldn't that be funny if you had someone who's trying to sort of sneak into right wing spaces and they literally just jokingly call themselves a Fed, but the joke is they really are one. Like
Yeah.
anyway, FBI informant says I think the bipartisanship is from military-industrial complex, long-term strategic rivalry with China. Okay, so he's saying that argument would say this isn't so much a bipartisan consensus about tariffs; it's a bipartisan consensus about treating China as an enemy.
Yeah, which I think,
Very plausible suggestion there, I think.
yeah, I think that agrees with what some of my later comments on the
Yeah,
matter
yeah.
were.
Okay, and then anything else? Yeah, interesting. I don't know if we have data on this. Blotto says, I believe Tesla customers were originally left wing, but not for the past 5 years or so.
Yeah, I
Could be. Yeah, you don't know, right?
no. The one thing I would say is that most people who buy cars are men, and
Mm,
there has been something of a shift since 2016 of the kind of politics of gender in the U.S.
that's true. And then finally, David Du Hadway says some bicycle shop owners and manufacturers are speaking out in some of my groups, spreading fear of price increases destroying our industry due to almost all products coming from China. Yeah, this is a world I didn't understand about until my kids started to want bikes. And I'm just thinking to go and get a $40 bike or something for the kids to tool around in,
Yeah,
right? And you
yeah,
walk into your standard bike shop and they're like, well, our cheapest bikes are $700. And it's like, wait,
yeah,
what happened with bicycles here?
yeah.
Everybody's like outfitting themselves like they're going to be doing the big bicycle races.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's even quite difficult to go to Walmart. Like my kids are a lot younger than your kids,
Yeah, yeah.
but it's hard to go to Walmart and buy like a crappy toddler bike for my 6-year-old.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they're there, but it's
Yeah.
it's it's changed. Bikes went high end somewhere in my lifetime, and I missed it
Well, and
until
they're
very
also like
recently.
it's like $100 to buy like an expletive toddler bike.
Yeah, yeah, which is yeah is going to be used until they outgrow it, which is very quick.
Yeah.
Uh,
So,
okay. Anyway, thanks for some great comments there. I think we're done. Oh, one last thing. So second time, so academic agent seems to have a sort of a standing offer that he can feature some of his friends on his regular rotation now of 5 recorded videos a week, 5 edited videos a week. Um, and this is the second time, right, Black Horse, that he's featured one
yeah.
from you.
Yeah.
And this came out today. And what's it about?
So there's a thesis presented by Jason Miranchuk a week ago. Um, there's there was a lot more to the podcast that they did. They talked
Yeah.
extensively about the dynamics of the private equity component of the U.S. military and industrial complex. But he referenced a thesis which has been going around the dissident right that suggests that a U.S. economic collapse is imminent. Um, I was asked to put together a response to this because I don't think the quality of the work that underlies that thesis is very high.
Hmm.
So I presented what I think is a very straightforward argument, um, twofold that there isn't a lot of evidence that the U.S. credit markets are at a critical point at this point.
Okay.
Um, but more importantly, the Federal Reserve is in command of the interest rate environment, absolute command.
Got it.
Um,
And AA, I know privately he commented on how you taught him some stuff about City of London he didn't know. Can you give us a little teaser on that?
yeah, so part of the argument that the Federal Reserve is not in command of the interest rate uh, environment comes from the assumption that this interest rate standard, LIBOR, um, is has historically been extremely important in the derivative market. Now, I didn't go into this in the video to any great degree, but this is a bit of a different audience. Um, LIBOR is a reference rate for derivatives contracts, but for the most part, interest exchanged in the derivative contracts that reference LIBOR has to do with the balance of payments on the derivative. So if you and I make a foreign exchange swap agreement, that swap agreement will have a reset date. So every quarter, if you did better out of the swap agreement, I'll send you money, or vice versa if the swap agreement goes in my favor. There's interest computed on that money, so there are a lot of uh, swap swap forward agreements, etc., that reference LIBOR, for which the fact that they reference LIBOR is incidental to the contract rather than the dominant factor in the contract. So the
Hmm.
importance of LIBOR as um, an interest rate convention is broadly overstated by people who don't understand the industry. Um, Having said that, it is an important interest rate convention, and it has historically been controlled by the LIBOR committee, which consists of a group of London banks. Um, Now, the piece that Academic Agent was unfamiliar with is that the LIBOR is actually an interest rate standard in rapid decline. So
Mm.
in the period between 2008 and 2014, there was a rate fixing scandal that went on among the LIBOR committee, where the LIBOR committee artificially uh, depressed the interest rate for LIBOR. I think there's a whole discussion to be had as to why they did that, but
Yeah.
they made it less sensitive to market events, and they artificially lowered the rate.
Hmm.
Um, this came out in the period in an investigation in 2014. Uh, Members of the LIBOR committee were fined and
Ooh.
driven out of the industry,
Whoa.
um, and uh, LIBOR, the Federal Reserve began working on a new standard to replace LIBOR that would be vulnerable to this kind of um, rate fixing. And so they came up with SOFR, which is a standard that relies on interbank lending rates in the U.S. primarily. Um, and so in 2013, there was a transformation where prior to 2013, most derivative contracts, something like 85% of derivative contracts referenced LIBOR. Now, the substantial majority of them reference SOFR. So LIBOR as an interest rate standard has become radically less influential. Um, at the same time, uh, the other sort of subordinate interest rate markets that are often referenced in when this is presented, things like the overnight repo market, things like the interbank loan market. In the period between 2020 and now, we have historical precedent of massive Federal Reserve interventions in order to manage rates in these markets. So we had a small intervention prior to 2020, but in the period between 2020 and 2023, we had an intervention in the overnight repo market by the Federal Reserve that peaked at $2.4 trillion of repos purchased by the Federal Reserve.
Right.
Um, so we have a, a pretty dramatic constellation of evidence that not only are the standards that are controlled, quote unquote, by the City of London in decline, but also when those standards are used to manipulate rates, it's called a scandal. Whereas when the Federal Reserve manipulates rate, it's called Federal Reserve policy, right? When the Federal Reserve engages in policy, people get promoted. When the LIBOR committee engages in policy, people get arrested and fined
Yeah,
and
yeah,
driven out of the industry.
yeah. This is the
Um,
old like when you do it, when I do it, it's war. When you do it, it's terrorism,
Yeah, exactly.
right?
So it's a very quick trick to demonstrate where sovereignty exists in a system,
Yeah.
uh, which is why is why I constructed the video the way I did.
Mm.
There's a whole constellation of deeper arguments that are made about the quote euro dollar system. Um, I could have alternately constructed a 2-hour video to review all those arguments in detail. I frankly, somebody's got to pay me money for me
Yeah.
to care enough to do that.
Right.
I thought this was the quickest and most rhetorically effective way to dismiss the argument completely,
Right.
um, without having to address every single part of the argument.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I've been hearing it from, including from at least one of our friends, that, um, you know, you don't understand. London is the real puppet master in all this, And yeah, you're saying you have trouble seeing evidence for that. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So, anyways, I present the argument. You know, I already have a collection of people in the comments talking about, well, why didn't you talk about the euro dollar or all this other stuff? And look, I did not present I didn't line up the 2 hour, like, this thesis is laid out in detail by a couple of different people. It's not exactly the same every time, but I didn't like
Hmm.
go through Tom Luongo's book or line up Stormy Waters' version of this argument and take every point and put it to bed. I intended to demonstrate really two basic truths. Uh, there isn't a lot of evidence that the U.S. credit markets are on the verge of collapse, and the Federal Reserve is in charge of interest rates. These are two pieces of information that really should not be controversial. And if you believe these two pieces of information, then that thesis is kind of dead in the water.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you a little story that what you're just telling me reminded me of. Uh, when uh, the general theory or whatever by Keynes, it came to be realized that it was being viewed as having had a really big impact. They said they came to F.A. Hayek, who had been friends with Keynes, by the way, um, and said, "Why didn't you tear apart Keynes's book?" And Hayek said, "Well, he came out with a book before that that no one remembers, um, which I carefully, surgically destroyed." And Keynes just was like, "Okay, yeah, you're right," and he just came out with another load of BS. So I was like, "What? What am I going to just be chasing him the rest of my life, knocking
Yeah.
down his next crazy argument?" And so that's why he just didn't bother. So anyway, I thought hopefully you can see why I brought that up.
Yeah. Well, anyways,
Yeah. Okay. Oh, we did have one thing slip in real quick, which is that faithful supporter Sam153 sends in a tip through via Subscribestar. Happy U.S. Thanksgiving next week. Thank you. Has Econ Minis ever done an economic analysis of the turkey market? No, we haven't,
we have
Sam153.
not.
And
Um,
your generous tip entitles you to getting a no on that. uh, okay, I think we are
one
all
other
good.
comment from
Yeah.
the chat
Oh.
that I wanted to address before
Oh.
we
Okay.
close.
Yeah.
It says, "I'm not worried about the economic situation in the U.S. I'm curious about the UK, Europe." Um, so, uh, uh, there's a couple of pieces. We've talked about the economic situation in continental Europe repeatedly. Uh, it is not very good. Um, but as a broader point, um, almost all of the small vassal states of the United States could have their economy ruined by accident by the United States tomorrow morning. It's just kind of the way it is. So, I talked about this briefly when speaking about the tariffs in Canada. Like, um, Canada's economy could be radically disrupted by some change in U.S. tariffs that is deemed politically beneficial in the US. Um, Americans wouldn't feel it, and Canadians could be like completely wrecked by it. That's just what it is to be part of an integrated imperial economy and not to be very politically important in that economy. Um, so it's a hard question to answer exactly what will happen in Europe. Um, a lot of it will depend on how U.S. tariff policy evolves, and particularly whether or not the green movement in Europe can be effectively addressed. As far as I can see, their domestic economies are just choking on energy prices, and either that issue will be resolved or not. And that's not a credit market story. That's a political story, and there are other
Right.
people who know a lot more about you know French politics or German politics or whatever than I do.
Well, you mentioned the effect of the EPA
Yeah,
on, I suppose, deindustrializing the U.S., right?
yeah, yeah.
They're trying to do a repeat performance in Europe, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a bit worse what they've done in Europe because, like, they already have all of the sort of anti-chemical industry uh, policies in Europe already, and they've kind of figured out how to run industry despite them. But in the United States, you're still allowed to generate electricity with natural gas at extremely high rates, and it's a very efficient way to generate electricity. In the in Europe, you can't build dams to generate electricity. You can't burn natural gas to generate electricity. You can't burn coal to generate electricity. Unless you're France, you can't have nuclear power. So, I don't know how an economy continues on with like we're getting dangerously close to the internal combustion engine bans that are going to kick in. I mean, in Canada, it's 2030, I think it is. Um, it's either 2030 or 2035. That's not so far in the future anymore. Um,
Yeah.
so, to speak just about Canada, if you ban internal combustion engines in Canada for new sale, life's going to get really miserable really, really quickly here. Um, so there's that's not like that's a lot worse than anything the EPA has ever done in the United States.
So Ted K will win in the end here, and the Industrial Revolution will be reversed and its consequences, right?
Oh my goodness, yeah. Uh, like I mean, I assume that the internal combustion engine ban in Canada won't ever actually take effect, but like
They could try.
they can try.
Yep.
I mean, it turns out that Cambodia can send everybody who wears glasses to a death camp. Like
That's right.
governments can do all kinds of weird things.
They can do these things. Yeah. Yeah. Um,
So
okay. Well, thanks very much. I think we're all caught up with comments and tips and super chats and all such things. Yep. Okay. Good. All right. Then, as I mentioned, I am planning to go to alternating the live streams with Black Horse with edited videos. I'm going to give that a try, see how it goes. Uh, though I wasn't thrilled with my production values doing it by myself, I was happy with my content on a edited video I tried recently about the Amerindian genocide hoax. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you give it a try. It's just 11 minutes long, I think. Um, but I'm gonna get some help from my graphic designer on the video editing, see if I can get those production values up a bit, and do some nice short videos that are easy to get through. And so anyway, I just have to sit down and write things and stuff, or pull from things I've already written, I guess. Okay, thanks very much, Black Horse. Hopefully, well, no, let's see. It'll be a while. So next week is Thanksgiving. I might get something out next week as an edited video, and then we would then be back together on December 5th, if that's a good day for you. Okay. Thanks, everybody, and see you next time.